Now for something completely different.
A couple months ago, I posted a video of me making a 5-string electric pipa for Zhaju Shen, who is the pipa player in a band called The Ether. Well, here's the second half of this build. This is an electric Erhu built for the Erhu player of the band, Yang Wang. The 3 members of the band are originally from China and they live in New York, and the concept of the band is to sort of merge modern and electronic music with these traditional Chinese instruments that they know and love. So one of the things that they're working towards as they do this is to modernize the instruments as well. These aren't instruments that are designed to replace the traditional, but rather to create something new that pays homage to the original. Doing things like adding fingerboards and electronics and changing and modifying traditional instruments very quickly gets you categorized as a heretic. And that's okay, that's my wheelhouse. I want to be in that place where we take things from the past and we respect them and love them, but we also bring them into the future. And that's what the band is all about, that's what I'm all about. And it was a match made in heaven. I've been having a blast creating these instruments. These are all prototypes and we're figuring it out as we go along, and we'll see what happens. But from what I can tell, I think that Yang is onto something. Before creating these CNC files and gluing up these pieces of locally salvaged elm, we had many discussions about how this would work and some of the good and bad things that would come out of adding a fretted fingerboard to the instrument. We're all very aware of what we were doing and we wanted to try it. So to me, my biggest concern with this was that, he wants to play this like an electric guitar at electric guitar volumes, and I thought that besides having the accuracy of the frets like a guitar for pitch perfection and whatnot, he was going to need a magnetic pickup. We'll talk more about that in a bit. You can see I'm jumping back and forth between some traditional, hybrid, and very modern CNC woodworking skills and techniques because this is a sketch. This is all being designed as I go, based off of this very inexpensive Erhu I picked up on eBay and some pieces of wood that I hot glued to it to represent a fingerboard at the very beginning of the video. So like for instance, right here I could have created a CNC file to cut this out, but honestly the amount of time it would have taken to get this block of wood held securely and to create the files and get all the measurements, I think that would take more skill than just doing it by hand with a chisel. So you can see I have the CNC machine running in the background while I'm doing that, and this to me is really 21st century woodworking. It's about combining these machines and some traditional woodworking skills to create new and exciting and unique things. Like I said, this is just right in my wheelhouse. So again here, I shaped the neck by hand because I didn't know how I wanted it to look and feel yet for the computer, and it just made more sense to do a 2D cut and then to do traditional woodworking to create the final hand shape. The CNC is really fantastic for repetition if you want to make multiples of things, and also for accuracy. So I used the CNC for accuracy in this case, and then used my hands for the artistry. Right here you can see I had this hole because we wanted to make the instrument sort of semi-hollow at first, but then it turned out to be too light, and Yang wanted to make sure that there's a little bit of weight and heft to it. So I literally just glued a piece of steel in that pocket, and that was based off of measurements and weights that he gave me of a target weight, and we put all the parts on the scale and got it to the target weight he wanted. And then much like the sister pipa that we made for his bandmate Zhaju, we're going with this black and sort of brushed aluminum look, so some of the parts I'm making out of aluminum. The instrument is traditionally played sitting down, but quite frequently Yang stands when he plays in his rock band, of course, and he has this really cool belt clip that I bought one and modified it to hold this so he can kind of wear it on his belt as he plays. But the other idea he wanted to try is to make an end pin for it, almost like a cello or a stand-up bass. And so that's what this plate has here, is a mounting hole for a traditional quarter 20 camera mount. And he bought a camera monopod that we still haven't quite worked out the kinks. We're working on a couple things to make it sit right against his body and not spin around, but it mounts right to that plate. I ended up having to modify it a little bit as I wanted to make a spot for the strings to reach around and attach. It's Again, like I said, I'm sketching. And then we decided that the best place to put the jack would be through the bottom so the cord could hang down and maybe be even affixed to this end pin or whatever. Now, since I cut all these pieces out on the CNC, I know they all fit together perfectly. I had to make a few adjustments to my cavity for the electronics, and I wanted to make sure I had room to access them all once it was glued together. Created that hole so I could, get the knobs in there and whatnot. And now it's time to glue this whole instrument together. Well, not the whole thing, but a good chunk of it. We also wanted to soften the corners. It looked too rectangular. I'm still fitting everything and figuring out how I want it to go. And so far, it's all looking pretty good. There's, of course, a lot of sanding involved. Now, the traditional Erhu is six-sided, so there's like a hexagon shape to it, and part of that hexagon shape is actually integral to the way he bows it. It's really kind of cool. The bow goes between the two strings that are on it, and you can see there's the hexagon shape. So I bent this piece of aluminum to replicate the missing edge, so his bow would have a reference point for when he's bowing down that side. This is my new favorite fingerboard material. It is by a company called Richlight, and it is made basically like micarta. It's paper that's put together with epoxy. It's even, consistent, and they have a very eco-friendly practice, so I highly recommend checking out Richlight. Since the fingerboard is so small, I was able to eke it out on the side of another job, but then I had the unpleasant task of trying to put frets in this little skinny thing.
This is the most insanely tedious thing I've ever done.
After a while, I developed a system where I held onto the fret wire, banged it in, cut it, and then went back and cleaned it up. And that made it a little bit easier. But when I was trying to cut those little pieces and manipulate them, it was a nightmare. I also used a little bit of Starbond CA glue in all of the joints just because they're so small. I wanted to make sure that there was enough teeth to grab the material and that they would purchase well. So by adding a little bit of CA glue into every seam, I know that it's all going to be nice and tight. And then I had to, of course, make the edges smooth and playable.
That's when it got really real, and tears was definitely
This is a real look at the pace, but this is what it felt like. The goal for the electronics was to put two pickups in it, a traditional piezo, which I wanted to be buried and hidden in the body, and then also that magnetic pickup, which we'll get to again in a minute. So here I just, you can see I drilled a little bit of a hole in just to make that piezo sit flat, glued it down. I filled in that hole with a little bit of epoxy, and then I used wood glue and put a veneer over the whole thing. It doesn't matter that it doesn't match because it's all going to get painted. So this way it's just completely hidden in there, and no one would ever even know. And then I messed up the veneer, so I had to put it in primer and get some Bondo in there to sort of fill in that little chip, which worked really well. You'll never see it. It didn't matter that I painted the whole body before the fingerboard, because since I'm using Richlight for the fingerboard, I can't use wood glue to glue it on. I need to use epoxy. So the epoxy will stick to the paint just like it would the bare wood. And I taped off the area around it because the fingerboard does overhang that lip a little bit. I didn't want to have all sorts of epoxy gunk there. And I just had to carefully line it up and let it sit. Now, here's something I haven't mentioned yet. The other thing we're doing with this Erhu that makes it non-traditional is it's got an extended scale. We added a fifth lower to it than a traditional Erhu. Now, in order to play it traditionally, then we would need to add a capo of some sort. And so we hemmed and hawed about how to make this either like a moving nut or a capo that would work with the existing frets, and I came up with this very simple solution. I cut a little hole into the fingerboard, and I just got a $1 spring clamp from the hardware store that we just pop into that hole and squeeze the strings down into position on that 5th fret, and it works perfectly. This is a piece of some aluminum signboard that I use to polish up and make a cover for the electronics cavity. This is going back maybe 15-20 years in my career. There was this company called Linear Pickups, and they made these pickups for guitars, and they were on a sliding rail system, and they each snapped in and out, so you could actually change the pickup style that was in there, different windings and stuff, and you could slide them back and forth in your guitar to find the sweet spot. And the guy's out of business for a long time now. Last I heard, he had some trouble with the law. But I had bought a bunch of them for messing around with making double bass pickups because I could radius them, and this is an early prototype, and that's what I'm going to use right now. The wiring is simple. I just gave each pickup its own volume knob instead of having its own on-off switch. This way he could actually blend the two pickups. He could have 80% magnet and just a little tiny bit of piezo, or vice versa, and that all went together pretty well. I mounted the surrogate body piece of the instrument to help his bow. I guess we could call it a bow guide. And I cut these little tiny circles out of vinyl record to just cover over the screws and give it a more consistent look. And sticking with the aluminum theme, I just cut a little tiny piece of aluminum off and polished that up to create the bridge. So the bridge just has 2 strings that goes over it, and it's just a pressure fit like a regular violin. And that was surprisingly fun to do. I measured the string spacing off of the donor instrument that I had and just used the file to carve little notches for the strings. That all worked pretty well. And then I also needed to make a nut for it where the strings get closer together and actually share the same slot. And I used a little bit of ebony cutoffs that I have for that. My friend Mike of Off Your Rocker Woodworks actually works at a harpsichord factory in Connecticut, and once he mailed me a whole box of these little cutoffs from making their harpsichord keys. Pretty cool, huh? And here's a look at the finished product before we hear it. And of course, there's always sawdust on it somewhere in my shop, and I don't ever see it until I'm done photographing it. But you can see it's it's about a 22-inch scale. How the strings sort of start at the nut together and then get wider at the bottom. The bow hairs, like I mentioned earlier, go between the strings, so you're bowing with both sides of the hairs. It's a really interesting instrument. There's that capo spot, so if we clip it there, it brings the scale length down. I think it's from 23 inches to 19 inches. I don't remember the numbers off the top of my head, but then that would be like the traditional instrument length. And there you have it. It's pretty ergonomic, pretty cool. This is something completely new. This is the vision of Yang. He had the vision of electrifying and modernizing this instrument, and he came up with this idea. I can't take credit. This is totally his baby. I don't even know how to play it, and I cannot wait to hear him play it for real, because from what I can tell from some of the social media interest in this is that I think he is onto something. Make sure you also check out the 5-string electric pipa that I made for Jaju. She's the pipa player in the band, and she also had a vision for a way to modernize her instrument that is incredible as well. These guys are super cool, so why don't you just have a listen.